Well, thank you to our Guild's program committee for inviting me to speak with you about writing a memoir. I know that quite a few of us have written in the form of a memoir, whether it's in poetry, an essay, collection of essays, or short stories, book-length narratives, or a hybrid form. I know we've had people writing all different types of memoirs. So I invited two other members of the Guild to join me for this discussion about writing a memoir. I'll speak first about my yet to be published book-length memoir, and then introduce Deborah Robinson to talk about her published memoir collection of short stories, Tough Guys, A Journey of Heroes. And Deanna Klein Shapiro will talk about her hybrid memoir of family history in poetry and prose, The Place You Live In, a Multi-Generational Immigrant Story. So I'm so pleased that both of you agreed to do this with me. I think it'll be interesting to all of us to learn a little bit more about the different forms a memoir can take. If all goes as planned, there will be time for questions at the end. So please jot them down as we go along. And the three of us have talked prior to this, so I'm hoping it will go okay. It's an experiment, but we'll see. So one of the first thoughts I had, one of the first questions is, are you a planner or a pantser when you write? So planners are people who develop outlines and work for them. They have maybe a short range plan and a long range plan. They know what form their memoir might take. And it's more of a, it's a very planful approach. And then there's those of us like me who are do it by the seat of your pants. And we didn't really realize we were getting into writing a memoir, and it kind of emerged over time. And then we end up with following our intuition about certain chapters that we write. And all of a sudden, someday the light bulb goes off or someone tells us, I think you have a book. And then you are trying to figure out how do you put the pieces together, the different parts to make a whole. So that's one question and it might be different in different forms for writers. So for example, when I'm writing a nonfiction magazine piece, I'm a planner. I know who I want to interview. I know what my subject matter will be. There may be surprises along the way of writing it or interviewing, but I have a method I'm using. When I got into writing this memoir, which I never planned to write a memoir. Most of you know I write poetry and nonfiction. My nonfiction writing always tended towards, when I was working, science and technical, writing about topics like sustainability, solar homes, climate change. And then in my spare time, I wrote about writers and did interviews with them for Poets and Writers and a couple other journals. I had a stint as a university public relations writer where I covered different departments at the university. And I also wrote as a freelancer for shelter magazines, the like home and, landscape magazines. My poetry is mostly unpublished, except for poems in a few anthologies. In general, I avoided the first person singular I. And a lot of that changes when you start to delve into a memoir. When the images from my childhood years in Trinidad, a Caribbean island just 5 miles north of Venezuela, kept surfacing from my dreams, something in me eventually knew I had to write them down. I began trying to understand what the dreams meant, what they wanted to say. In 1992, I started what I thought would be an essay with the words, I am cutting bush. Like an airwhack in the thick rainforest, I whack and saw at the pines and maple trees that have grown up to encase my parents' house. I have no machete, but instead the tools of the north, pruning shears and saw, create a wind through solid wood. It is something I've wanted to do for years. That was how it began. It has changed greatly since, not the least of which is that I went from first person present tense to first person past tense. And along the way, I tried third person, I tried short story form. I experimented because I really didn't know what I had. At some point in the 1990s, I read Michelle Cliff's book, Claiming an Identity They Taught Me to Despise. It was her hybrid poetry and nonfiction book about being Jamaican American and lesbian. The form was unlike anything I had read before. Being a hyphenated Caribbean American was still fairly new to me. Her book is the start of what inspired me to write my family's story. So I've thought about what I wanted to say is a couple of points in bold, and then I'll speak to them. But my point number one is giving voice to our experience in memoir is an empowering act where we seek to order our experiences and gain perspective. We are bringing experience into literacy, shaping it with words, naming emotions, describing scenes in an effort to share and communicate one's experience of life's events, and underline that goal to communicate. I think that's why most of us write these memoirs. Toni Morrison said, memoir equals self-recollection in William Zinsser's Inventing the Truth, the Art and Craft of Memoir. Recollection, the action or power of recalling to mind, tranquility of mind, even religious contemplation, is from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary online. We are collecting and recollecting ourselves as we write a memoir by putting together pieces of information, some formerly unknown, to create a whole, researching our past in order to make sense of the present, getting to know people no longer with us from fresh perspectives, and sometimes probing actions we took and decisions we made to better understand the consequences. Point two, a memoir is not autobiography, the reflection on an entire life, but rather focused on a specific time period or organized around specific events in a life. A memoir is like the facets of a precious stone, each one cut meticulously to reflect the light, and together they create a beautiful gem. Memoir writers share certain experiences from a period of their lives, and the sum of these parts make a whole text, a narrative that takes the reader on a journey. Memoir writers share personally because we have a deep desire to communicate our experience with the reader. We hope our readers may learn something new. We hope our readers might not feel as alone. By writing out our story, we find the words and so are no longer isolated. By polishing those facets, I eventually learned which ones earned a place in the final draft of the narrative. I have a file folder in my computer of the chapters I didn't use in the event an editor or agent asks for something more. So you make decisions along the way with at least my going by the seat of your pants method. And I don't believe any of that earlier writing is lost. I don't view that as any tragic event. Some of them were warm-ups for what was to come. Some of them were experiments with form or language. And slowly, what needed to be in the final text, which is about 300 pages, emerged. Point number three, memory is often unreliable. This is the conundrum of writing a memoir. Zinsser writes, the truth is a sliding scale of memory, and what the writer remembers is not what other people in the scene remember. However, in a memoir, it's the writer's memory that counts. But she was like that to me, and that's the only truth that the writer of a memoir can work with. The writer of a memoir has to have confidence in their memories. Sometimes we can show a scene through another's perception from doing an interview or finding new facts. However, in memoir, the truth of the narrative rests with the author. Point four, You make a contract with the memoir reader that you will, in all circumstances, hone to the truth to the best of your ability. And if you stray from that, because recollection is imperfect, you will let the reader know your uncertainty and instances of surmising. So you find ways to say, it might have gone like this, was one of the terms I used when I tried to reimagine scenes. Or you say, you know, my father has since passed away and I can no longer ask him these questions. You carry the reader along with any uncertainties of memory you have, because you want to still create the trust with the reader that what you're offering is an honest narrative. In journalism, you write stories from direct observation, taped interviews, and research. When we are relying on that unreliable factor, our memories, I think about that Japanese film by Akira Kurosawa, Rashomon, which probably many of you may have seen. It's one of his masterpieces where a rape and a murder occur. And in the film, then the events that happened are seen through the perspectives of a woodcutter, a bandit, the bride, and the samurai husband's ghost. Each person recalls the events differently. A memoir gives the author license to give their version of events. However, the contract with the reader is that you will do your homework and fact check, fact check, fact check. You will do background reading. You will seek to corroborate parts of the story with interviews from other people who were there. You will do genealogical research, seek out birth and death certificates, look at ship manifests, and spend time in national and military archival research to understand other events happening at the time. You will let the reader know when you're not certain about something. You will keep researching and writing to earn the reader's trust and continued willingness to accompany you on this journey. Point 5, writing a memoir risks upsetting certain relationships, may involve family members who are living. It could lead to hurt feelings, even lawsuits. For example, when psychologist Mary Trump's 2 books about her Uncle Donald led him to sue her for $100 million. So these things happen. And both the writer needs to think about that. And especially when it comes time, if you're not self-publishing, your publishing companies, their lawyers are going to go through things with a fine-tooth comb. So keep your research, keep it organized, know what your sources are for different assertions you make in the book. Here's another quote from Zinsser in Inventing the Truth, because he also has an essay, a memoir essay in this book. When I started writing my chapter, I was half paralyzed by the awareness that my parents and my sisters were looking over my shoulder, if not actually perched there, and would read whatever version of their life came out of my typewriter. This is me speaking now. The memoir writer is willing to take certain risks and may take measures to mitigate others. How the writer parcels out page time for a character in a story might be influenced by the knowledge of what might be hurtful to another or perceived as an invasion of privacy. How important is this truth to the story? Remember, it is the writer's memory that filters the truth of a memoir and constructs the narrative. And then there's that pesky contract with the reader. We can take steps to mitigate hurts and misunderstandings by letting living people read the sections where they appear. We can even give them pseudonyms in the text and acknowledge that in an author's note in the beginning. We may even decide to let them read the entire work. It's a choice for the writer to make. Excuse me. Point number 6, what is the mission of your narrative? The historical term from the US colonial period for someone like me was a quadroon, a person with 1 quarter, and that's from the Spanish word cuarto, or fourth, that is one biracial parent, and that would be my father, and one parent of European ancestry, which would be my mother. My father's ancestry was African and Caucasian, and East or European, it's now called. My mother was of European ancestry, Eastern European and Jewish. Another way to think of it is one grandparent of African ancestry and three grandparents of European ancestry. It all gets really complicated. I didn't know any of this growing up in the 1950s. I didn't know that my father had served in both the Black and white US Army during World War II. I didn't know that at the time my parents married in New York City, their union was considered illegal in many states in the country. People of mixed race occupy a strange place in American literature known as the tragic mulatto from the late 1800s to the 1940s, and even continuing to Philip Roth's 2000 contemporary novel of racial passing, The Human Stain, which was also made into an excellent movie that's pretty close to the novel. Things don't usually turn out well for the mixed race person, especially one who is passing for white. The person often has a terrible death, suffers never seeing a beloved parent again, loses family, can't find success or true love. The litany of woes goes on and on. This year's Sarasota County One Read book is the historical novel, The Personal Librarian, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. It's based on the real life story of J.P. Morgan's personal librarian, a woman of African descent, who passed for white throughout her career. She chose not to reject her family, but lived this double life between her personal life and her work life. And the book is really interesting because it's written by a partnership of two women writers, one of European ancestry and one of African ancestry. It reframes the older tragic narrative into one of empowerment against the odds. And this was very much something I worked with in my text. I was keenly aware of this narrative of the tragic mulatto, and I said, well, that's not my story, and tried to take a different path. My introduction to the phenomena of passing began with a friend introducing me to a Jamaican professor of literature at Howard University. She gently taught me about the challenges my father must have faced in his coming up years. And I should say I was really angry at my parents for not letting me grow up into an adult without having this part of my heritage, and also not knowing half my family. I later took an elective graduate course in literature of the Harlem Renaissance, where I was introduced to Nella Larsen's 1929 novel, Passing. I read many other novels, memoirs, and autobiographies about mixed-race people as I wrote my book. I gradually understood that my story went against the narrative of endless tragedy, and this was why I wanted to write it. The breaches in my family at both ends of the Atlantic Ocean were gradually, sometimes painfully, mended as I first traveled to Trinidad as an adult, and then as we all began traveling back and forth, ultimately giving my father times to reunite with his brother and one sister. His youngest sister still lives in Australia. The nieces and nephews he'd never met, and numerous cousins. So to answer the questions, just a second. I asked, I'm going to now answer the questions I asked both Deanna and Deborah. And so you should be able to hopefully compare and contrast some of this. Why did I write this memoir? I wrote my memoir to order and understand the experiences that led me to seek out my Trinidadian family, despite all my parents did to encourage me to let it lie in the past. What were the circumstances that made us first go to Trinidad and then leave without goodbye to anyone? Why were my brother and I cautioned to never talk about those years? My family story, while not an easy one, has its origins as American imperialism reached into the global South and British colonialism still held sway in the Caribbean islands from a history of the sugar plantations, the trade in enslaved Africans, and later the period of indentured servitude from India and China, among other nations. When I lived in Trinidad, it was a British colony. Today, it is the independent nation of Trinidad and Tobago, the southernmost Caribbean island, just 5 nautical miles off the coast of Venezuela. There was a lot to unpack about race, history, and family. Who's my intended audience? I've always seen my book as one that could be used in education, perhaps in a high school or college English class. I've had younger readers test read it, and they liked it. I felt like I'd accomplished something. Adult readers have also liked it and given me positive feedback. What type of research did I do to corroborate this story? I used letters, historical records like birth certificates, my parents' marriage certificate, military discharge papers, death certificates, interviews with family members and friends of my parents. Many books and articles were read for background. My book isn't a scholarly work with footnotes. My memoir is a narrative informed by research. I include a resource list of books, articles, and films at the end that might be of interest to a reader who wants to explore the topics raised further. What writing technique books were helpful? I read books about writing memoir and how to be a better writer. I went back to graduate school when I was 42 and earned a master's degree in nonfiction writing. So I'd been working on these essays about 10, maybe 4 or 5 years by that time. The master's program required a ton of reading, and I was able to, through my research projects, keep to what I wanted to learn about for these essays. I taught writing to freshmen as part of my assistantship, which helped me to develop my craft. My master's program allowed me to study both poetry and nonfiction in depth. I read lots of novels and nonfiction later. 3 books that I always keep by me are Inventing the Truth, The Art and Craft of Memoir, edited by William Zinsser, The Craft of Revision by Donald Murray, and One Writer's Beginnings by Eudora Welty. What form does my memoir take? My memoir is a book-length narrative, about 100,000 words, 300 pages, that includes letters, a poem, and hopefully a few song lyrics if I can get permission to use them. I had no idea how highly regulated song lyrics are by the industry. You have to be so careful. You can't even put them in a draft because you can be sued. My hoped for title, Coming Round Right, Navigating Family and Race, is taken in part from a Shaker song in the public domain. Phew, that one passed the test. So that's about my part of this presentation. And I want to introduce Deborah Robinson to speak next about her book, Tough Guys, A Journey of Heroes. I should also mention she also has another published book, another memoir, I understand, but this was the one we focused on for this talk. Deborah is 64 years old. The military-connected illnesses and deaths of her son and husband are not exclusive to her family. Many veterans, both young and old, continue to suffer silently. Spreading awareness of the many issues facing military families was my goal while writing and publishing Tough Guys, A Journey of Heroes. Thousands of veterans battle daily with the effects of Agent Orange, post-traumatic stress disorder, and traumatic brain injuries. Substance addiction and homelessness plague countless veterans. Sharing the struggles that our family encountered while navigating the VA system continues to be important for me. Thank you so much, Deborah, for agreeing to talk about your book today.
Sure. Thank you so much, Denise. It was lovely talking to Denise on the phone. I got to know her better. You know, we know each other in these little squares and outside of it sometimes, but it's Everybody has their story. That's right. So I'm going to say probably it was about 10 years ago, because my son has been gone. Next month, it will be 11 years. That's when I had some more time to catch my breath, and try to assemble what our story was, how it affected our family. And some of the people, I'm going to say a few of the people, because this was all, I'm a by the seat of my pants person kind of thing too, Denise. When the memories come to me and I can just like spew them out on paper or on an electronic device, I usually feel good. We do. It's cathartic, but I will spit it all out, put it down, come back to it, which we're advised to often in another day or two, or maybe have someone that I feel safe with read it and say, can you follow that? And then I will edit it. One level, as we know, edit and edit and edit. And I have not had a professional editor. I've had great retired English teachers that I'm lucky enough to have friendships with that have done it, done some editing, gentle editing, I might add. The fact that you are fond of them and have a history with them usually makes it so someone's not going to change the whole climate of what you're trying to tell. Even when the grammar isn't perfect, but it's what my Vietnam veteran late husband, that's how he would have said it. And when the words aren't always pretty, because they're not always. So I would like to read. And another question Denise asked me, and I guess I hadn't looked at my book in a while. You do that. They're in a box. COVID kind of put things at a standstill, and I need to get out there because I did order 225 more books. I have either donated or sold 500 copies of my itsy bitsy Hart. That's that my book is. I need to get out there, get some book signings arranged so that my message does get out. Some of my favorite places to do that are VA hospitals. I became very familiar with VA hospitals, more than I ever wanted to be, and our local ones here in Michigan, and have donated many of these books to their post-traumatic stress disorder inpatient unit, which there was only one in Michigan. There needs to be more. And also to the several outpatient PTSD clinics that there are in Michigan anyway. I also, North Chicago was also another large VA center that my son was treated at also. So with that, I am going to read to you my first story that I ever wrote. It was while my son was still alive. This is a day in the hospital with my late husband when I was very green and new to the whole thing. He had just been diagnosed with multiple myeloma, which is strongly linked to Agent Orange and one of the 15 or 16 diseases that the government will take responsibility for those that were in Vietnam during that time period. So here goes. Tough guys. Who would have thought that shit could kill you? It's been 30 years and what the hell? Newt's face revealed the disgust he felt as the bright orange liquid dripped from the clear bag, snaked down the tube, then squeezed through the wires sticking out of his chest. It's like a bag full of the flu. God, I hate this. I figured the cigarettes and booze would have killed me, not some goddamn spray Uncle Sam decided wouldn't hurt us. Oh, sure, it'll kill trees, but not people. And it pisses me off. Newt's voice bellowed down the hospital corridor and then weakened as he began to retch, holding his fist to his lips. Tears found their way down his wrinkled, pale cheeks. Newt shook his nearly bald head in disbelief as the whole story seemed like a sick joke. He remembered getting his draft noticed and trying not to look scared. Let's just move to Canada, was a suggestion of one of his best friends from high school. Some of the guys freaked out, never did act right again. Not him. He sucked it up and got over it. And now, when he should be enjoying retirement, some stinking thing in his blood screwed it all up. Luck wasn't something he'd had a lot of. Newt knew he didn't fit the favored patient list in the cancer unit. The nurses tried to avoid his room when they could. He complained about everything. A pain in the ass is what he was. The doctors weren't even too keen on stopping at his room during their rounds. It was no mistake that they did the mandatory visit to Newt's room in the middle of the night. Yeah, Newt could definitely wreck your day. The do not resuscitate sign outside his room caught the eye of all that slinked past. Occasionally, the ornery old veteran grabbed his IV pole, unplugged it, and headed for the door. Before entering the hallway, he looked carefully both ways to avoid meeting anyone on his way out. Exchanging pleasantries wasn't his bag, and he didn't want to make small talk. Newt would stare out the window at the end of the hall until his legs got wobbly. Cussing under his breath, he'd shuffle back to his room. He watched the clock and sighed out loud as the minutes ticked by. He stared at his bruised arms as if they belonged to someone else. The skin sagged, and he tried to remember when it had gotten that way. When did I turn from a regular guy that did normal stuff to some freaking invalid? I can't even mow my own lawn. I used to bitch about it. I used to bitch about a lot of things. Dolores, the staff dietitian, dutifully walked into Newt's room with a plastered on smile. He knew she'd lost the bet with the other kitchen staff, and now it was she that had to come down here. A slight smirk spread over Newt's face. You haven't filled out your meal card, Newt. What would you like for dinner tonight? I'll read the choices to you. Well, let's see here. We have chicken and mashed. Newt, I have to ask you, it's my job. Newt was staring defiantly, his middle finger raised like a weapon into the air. With a crimson face, Dolores left the room as she muttered under her breath, asshole. In case you haven't figured it out, I kind of had my hands full during the 25 years I was married to this guy, just a little bit. I felt that he was mine enough and we had endured enough. I could tell all these things. Encounters like these seemed to make the day go by a little bit easier for Newt. After all, someone had to keep them on their toes around here. Being pissed was a hell of a lot better than giving them all what they seemed to want. I ain't no panty waster crybaby. His jaw tensed with the idea. Newt sat back in his reclined bed and looked at the wallet-sized picture in the tiny frame. He kept it to himself and turned it down when anyone was in the room. If any of them would see it, it'd make him look soft, and he didn't want anyone feeling sorry for him, the sons of bitches. None of their damn business. This photo was like looking into a mirror, except for the smile looked like Deb's. He stared at the picture, hoping it would change. Maybe his youngest boy wouldn't really be overseas doing what his old man had done. Damn, I tried convincing the little shit not to join. The hard-headed kid wouldn't listen to a thing I said, just like dear old dad. It seemed like a long time ago when he and Deb found out why he'd been so tired all the time. Nothing looked or felt the same anymore, and the treatments knocked him on his butt. The night that Deb had finally told Brian about the cancer made Newt cringe just remembering her words. Bri, there are so many new treatments for cancer these days. People get better all the time. Don't worry, honey. They're taking real good care of your dad. Her overly optimistic voice was high and strained as she talked fast and held her breath. Leave it up to me to let her do all the hard stuff. What's new? He'd wanted to get on the phone to reassure Brian, but didn't trust himself to keep the emotion out of his voice. God, I'm a coward sometimes. The last couple of years had been less than smooth when it came to the whole father-son thing. They sent messages to each other by way of Deb. Most conversations ended in a hassle when they actually did talk. Secretly, Newt was relieved when the kid finally finished his high school and signed up for the Army. Damn kid could use some discipline. Brian had a lighthearted personality like his mom, and it irritated Newt sometimes. Deb and Brian would sit and talk for hours. Newt would hear them laugh as he sat watching TV. I wonder what's so damn funny out there. Newt closed his thin, veined eyelids, hoping for sleep. He wished for this misery to just be done. Well, after he sees Brian one more time, he dozed fitfully, jerking off, and as the nausea tried to take over. The pills they handed him every few hours made him groggy, but comfort wasn't a feeling that he knew anymore. Can't even have a few beers to take the edge off without puking. Newt watched the door and knew Deb would be breezing in any minute now after she got out of work. He grimaced when he thought of how tired she looked lately. Deb tried so hard to hide the fatigue that was clouding her still pretty face. Little kudos to me, you guys. Deb, I guess you can write whatever you want, right? I could have been a little nicer. She put up with a lot of my shit. When did she start looking so worn out? I wonder if she were sick, the sick one, if I'd take care of her. Yeah, right. Deb sailed into the dreaded room as if she were happy to be there and kissed Newt carefully on the cheek. The beautiful head of hair she'd always been so proud of was gray at the roots and in desperate need of a trim. How are you feeling, honey? I missed you. Did the doctor tell you when you could come home? How were your blood counts today? It seemed like Newt hadn't heard her questions. Quietly, without looking up, he asked, did he call? The words ended in a choke. He didn't want to worry his obviously frazzled wife with what he'd seen on CNN this afternoon. Chopper down, Afghanistan. 6 assumed dead is all the words said across the bottom of the screen. As much as Newt tried to avoid the news, he seemed drawn to it. He didn't think his gut could hurt worse than it already did, but he was wrong. Deb whispered, no. She busied herself arranging get-well cards and gathering up dirty clothes. It was all closing in on her, and she wasn't sure what to do or say next. Maybe it was time she take a leave from work. She's so tired, just so tired. No one seems to fake happiness for me like I do for all of them. I need to sit down for a minute. Deb collapsed into the vinyl padded chair next to the bed, exhaling the stale air from her lungs. Her heavy head slumped down onto her chest. They sat in silence. There was nothing to say. It had all been said, and it didn't change any of the facts. Grating hospital sounds echoed through the hallways. Both of their faces registered exhaustion and agitation. Was this it after all these years of raising kids, working, and staying married? Some reward. Newt's bruised fist relaxed just a little as he reached over and touched her hand. He traced the blue veins gently and hooked his index finger around hers. She squeezed lightly with a familiarity only they could possibly know. Deb looked into Newt's eyes and forced a tiny yet tired smile. Her eyes told him that it was going to be okay. She'd be here. She'd always been there. Still pretty too. That was another one of my kudos to myself. Shrill ringing brought them both back to consciousness as they looked at the phone. Newt's trembling hand lifted the phone from its cradle and raised it to his ear. A gravelly hello came out. His eyes widened as the rigid face relaxed just a little. Hey, son, I'm doing okay. How about you? Here, I'll get your mother. Even though the lighthearted yakking his son was so good at seemed foreign, he actually chuckled in his hoarse, deep voice. Yeah, we did that too. Damn, I guess some things never do change, huh? Okay, I'll tell Mom you said hi. Yeah, me too, buddy. Be careful. Newt hung up the phone and took a sip of water. He cleared his throat as he avoided Deb's gaze. Finally, he gave up and let her see the tears pooled in his eyes. Swiping at the moisture gathering on his cheeks, Newt looked directly at his wife. What? Quit staring at me. What did he say, Newt? Does he seem okay? Come on, Newt, tell me. Did he get my package in the mail? Deb's voice rose louder as she waited for an answer. God, he could be irritating. Newt, he's okay. He just wanted to talk to his old man. Newt set the tiny picture back upright. Yeah. In this story, it was my first story. I realized throughout it, and so did the creative writing teacher at the community college where I took the class and wrote this. He said, you know, I usually don't recommend folks use the curse words, but he said, there's no other way this Newt guy that I never knew, he said, there's no other way for this Newt guy to talk. It fit, you know, some of the swear words and curse words and such. And he also said, in case you don't realize, you changed point of view twice through this. Denise got it. Yeah, you changed point of view. But he said for some, well, and we know memoir writing, our own creative writing, we break rules that are, you know, the standard rules. So yes, and he is right. That was changed, the point of view, but I left it in. So when Denise asked me what my typical style was of writing, or what would I say my book looked like I said, I hadn't been through this book in a while. It's in a box in the corner in the closet. But I do see that there are a couple of stories in here where I have, one of them, I took on an inanimate object. It was my son's Cabbage Patch doll, Harvey, and I still have this Cabbage Patch doll. And I took on that as getting part of my story out. This is the 13-year-old that is down sleeping right now when she was really little. It's my son when he was 6 months old and got his doll. And so these pictures, especially with the people that know me and family members and even neighborhoods, I think pictures can really help to portray. A picture says 1,000 words sometimes, as we said. Most of this is complete nonfiction of my several little short stories. One of them does have some fiction in it, and it's what I imagined a conversation would be in heaven between my husband and my son on Memorial Day as they watched down how the rest of the family and how the United States would celebrate that patriotic day. So that one was, it's fictitious with factual things in it. So,
Deborah, could I just ask a question?
Sure.
Because I think this is really interesting. You described to me that you called your book short stories.
Yeah, because maybe
I
I can. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that was really interesting, especially I, read looked through the book and read sections of it. And I thought that was a really interesting way to put it. Could you maybe just talk a little bit about how you thought of the short stories? Because the entire book, I think if I remember right, is about 90 pages. Is that right?
It is only 49 or 50, Denise, actually, although it may have come across from my Dropbox to you in a different form.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think that's really interesting.
59.
The form of it is very interesting. It also makes it very readable to sit down. You could actually read it in one or two sittings, but just if you could talk a little about your thoughts behind how you chose that form, I think that would be interesting.
I would say that, okay, so a couple of these, more of them are about our son more than my late husband, because what a mom has in her heart, not that we don't love our husbands or our partners, but so most of them are about my son. So it was I already had a couple of stories, and a couple of these short stories that I had written as a presentation or awareness to veterans groups. Once my son had passed, and I shared with you, Denise, that his care was so all-encompassing and consuming because of the mental health side of it, and then the legal system that went along with some of those poor choices and behavior that happens with addiction. I finally had time, and as a memory would come to me, and sometimes it would be driving past one of the VA hospitals going shopping, and maybe Brian had been gone for a couple of years already, and I would all of a sudden something would come to me of one day, and I do have a couple of more one day type of things in the hospital or at a walk-in clinic or something. This would be spurred, and I would probably rush home or sit with a pencil and paper the old-fashioned way and just spit it all out, the things that I had learned. And I could then sometimes I could add that painful part, and then I would sweat as I was doing that, but I had it down, and then I would get that story written, and almost always I would feel good about the fact that I laid it down, I read it, changed some of the things. And I also, what you were talking about, Denise, as far as your family members when you're disclosing, my late husband, I have two stepchildren that were his from his first marriage. Brian was the only child I had. I had to be cautious, and with my late husband's sisters, and said, you don't, because it doesn't portray Newt as the sweetest guy all the way across the board. So I asked them all, hey, and an overwhelming from the kids and his my late husband's three siblings, my brother and sister-in-laws, they said, it's so perfect and it shows you love them. You're not saying bad things. You're not, and I said, okay, well, I just wanted, because they were, you would have had to live, but we all have to live one another's lives before we understand exactly how the words get written. But when I put them all together finally and decided I need to do something with this. And so I had like 12 of these, what I called short stories. And I just put them in order randomly, actually. And the lovely lady that has a tiny little publishing company out in the middle of a cornfield up here in rural Michigan. She helped me put it together. She helped with the cover design. She's not a very experienced, but I thought she did a lovely job and allowed me to put them in a certain order. Sometimes I would just do it because one might have been really short. And so I would maybe put that after a really long one, because my goal was, like you said, Denise, to let people be able to sit down, and many people said they read it in one sitting because it's doable that way.
Yeah, that's really good. Were there any particular writing technique books that one or two that really stayed with you, that were assisting to you, or did it just unfold organically over time?
That was it. I have to say, I did go on to some of the little tools that you have when I thought, now which I'm not bad at grammar, but there's so many rules, and you don't want a lot of grammar errors and punctuation, because that's distracting. So I would go in and get rules. And I also had friends. I honestly did not read a book. Probably should have, but I didn't. And I would just Google parts of speech, or I would send it to my favorite 2 or 3 media specialist retirees, not librarian, media specialists. They corrected me. So they would help me out with some of the grammar and the sentence structure. And when I had 8 million, honestly, and I know I'm exaggerating, exclamation points. Well, that's how I talk. But there were way too many, and it was very distracting. So a friend pointed that out to me. So they were just pretty much randomly. And I also, once I had my stories together, I came up with a couple more that I wanted to quickly write and get included in here into my little tiny book.
Well, that's wonderful. And you make a very important point about having readers who helped your book develop. I was also very fortunate in that I have one retired friend who turns out loves grammar, and she did a word by word editing of my book, and
Yes.
without telling me, you know, she had been a reader over different time, and then she just emailed me this one day, Denise, if this might be helpful to you, here's my take on the grammar. I couldn't believe anyone would do that for me.
And
Yeah.
want to. To
I
me,
mean,
that's like a little boring, you know?
yeah, like that's why you pay a copy editor, which I
Yes.
fully had expected. But man, you know, she was a retired lawyer, and she
Yes.
liked doing this. I
That's
couldn't believe
amazing.
it.
Yeah.
So our readers are very important to the development of
Mhm.
these memoirs, I think. And sometimes they might be a first reader, like the people closest to you who you'll show your what I think of as raw work to
Yeah.
you, before it's
Mhm.
too refined. And then there are readers at different levels. And then you get those absolute gems of readers who'll say, sure, I'll read the whole book and
Yeah.
look at it as a whole. I mean, that's an incredible gift of time for someone
Yes.
to give. And,
Yes.
you know, and all of them are steps along the way for these memoirs taking shape as a
Yes.
book. Deborah,
Yes.
I want to give Deanna a chance to talk. Is
Yeah.
there anything else you'd like to add to what you've said that we didn't cover, or from the questions that we talked about?
I think I spit everything out that I wanted to. You can tell, and I really can. So, but thank you so much, Denise. I
Thank you
appreciate it.
so very much for joining in this today. And I just have to say, I really appreciated getting the opportunity to get to know you better. And I remembered when we met in person, hearing something about your book and the days when we would
Mhm.
show each other the books.
Yeah.
And so I'm so glad I followed up on that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So now we're going to turn to Deanna Klein Shapiro, Deanna is a poet and a painter who has published 3 books and a chapbook, the latest of which is Companions Along the Way. Her poems have been published in Poetica, The Aurorian, Tapestries, Penwood Review, Blue Line, and Zigzag Lit, among others. She was nominated for a Pushcart Prize and has won awards from the Poetry Society of Vermont. She has been a member of the Otter Creek Poets Workshop for 24 years. She has a degree in English and early childhood education from Hunter College in New York City, and holds graduate degrees in music education and school psychology. So Deanna, take it away and introduce us to your wonderful book, which, where did I put it? I have it right here. The Place You Live In, and an a family immigrant story. So Deanna, take it away. You have to unmute.
Thank you, Denise. I loved both of your stories, and mine is yet again different in that, well, first of all, I only knew one grandparent. And so I designed this cover, and I don't know how well you can see it, but here is my grandmother. Here am I. Here is a shofar, but actually a cornucopia filled with nourishment, and also the apple symbolizing nourishment, and the moon, which is a very favorite symbol of mine. And when I started this book, it was a soulful thing for me to do for myself. I needed to find out about my family. I knew relatively little. My grandparents from Eastern Europe never talked to their children, my parents' generation, about their experiences in Eastern Europe. That was a common thing. And in the 1990s, I suddenly got extremely interested in my genealogy and my family history. So I started doing genealogical work. I got a bunch of death certificates from family members and was really shocked to note some interesting and intriguing information on them. I then took a class in essay writing, and I began writing about families, my family. When we moved to Vermont, I tried to find another writing group, and I didn't. But I did find a poetry group, the Otter Creek Poets. And I thought, well, let me see what this is all about. As it turned out, I really enjoyed poetry because I was always about writing the narrative. I write narrative poetry, period. But with poems, I could be very concise and economical. I could tell a short story in one poem, and it wasn't as long as an essay. So that became my modus operandi. I joined the poetry group, and all I wrote for several years were poems about my family. They just went on and on and on. And it was a very important moment for me because I didn't know I was writing a book at all. I was just finding out about my family. And so when you ask, why did I write this memoir? Well, I wrote it for myself. I truly wrote it for myself. It was a labor of love. I needed to know more about my family, and I didn't know it from my family. So how was I going to find out about it? I did interview my parents, thank goodness, before they died. But my father was the youngest of 5, and all his siblings were gone. And I so wished that I could have interviewed them to get their perspectives and what they remembered before they died. Since my father was the youngest, I was also one of the youngest cousins. So I had cousins that were 10, 12, 14 years older than I was. I interviewed them, and they gave me some perspective about the family and about things that I never knew about before I was born. But that's all I had. So where was I going to find out more information? Well, I did a ton of research, and I loved every minute of it. I was appalled to find out the conditions that my grandparents lived in Eastern Europe. And although my father never knew the town they even came from, I was able to realize that when they came here, they formed societies to help each other. There was no social security. So they formed these societies, and the names of the societies were named after the town they came from. So I found out that the Podiatsa Society that they belonged to, that was the town they came from. Well, I was in heaven, and I began looking for books that talked about it was Austria-Hungary when my grandparents lived there. It had been Poland. It became Austria-Hungary. Today it's Ukraine. So I began reading all that I could about Austria-Hungary. It was the Habsburg Empire during the rule of Franz Joseph. And I began reading every book I could find about the Habsburg Empire. And I found out a lot. Actually, Franz Joseph was good to the Jews, as I later learned, but my grandparents, I mean, he was in Vienna, which was all the way west, and my grandparents were all the way east in a province called Galicia, which was very much downtrodden, behind times, and very, well, just very backwards. And they had pogroms there. And I mean, it was a very, very tough existence. So I was able to understand from these books some of the history. And then I went to the Tenement Museum because they came to the Lower East Side of New York City. And what that must have been like to leave forever without internet and without smartphones, to be able to hook back to whom they left behind and what they left behind. I can't imagine how they did this, and the trauma. And the Lower East Side tenements, oh my God, that's a whole other story of how terrible. I mean, how many people fit into this one small area of New York City is unimaginable. And I visited the Tenement Museum, and it was horrifying. And there was a newspaper, a Jewish newspaper called the Forwitz, and my grandfather apparently always read it. And it was edited by a man named Abraham Kahan, and he had a column which became a book about what the immigrants would write to him, their problems and their questions. What should I do about this or that? It was so poignant as to the terrifying feelings they had and the shame they had and the questions they asked. And so from all of that, I picked up a lot about what my family went through. And so here I was with all of these poems and all of this research. And I said to myself, I think I would like to publish this. I had no idea that that was going to be the outcome when I first started this whole journey. And then I thought further and I said, well, but the poems tell a story, and I could have just published the poems, but I'd like to add some more. So I decided that I would break it up into sections. And so what I did was, I named each section. This one says pulling together. And then I wrote a paragraph or a page about that topic. And then I wrote a poem, it also about that topic. So that's how the whole book goes. It goes prose, poem, prose, poem. And whenever I read biographies, I love to see photographs of these people that I'm reading about. So I chose to put photographs and quite a few of them throughout the book to give a visual. And I liked having my own platform. I liked doing what I wanted to do and not what some publisher wanted me to do, because I had written another book that was published by a small independent press. And when I wanted to put photographs in that, she had an objection because she had a bad experience prior to that. So I really liked having my own sway and doing the book in the manner that suited me. So let me see what some of these other questions were. My intended audience, well, I really wanted this for my family, for my younger generations, because I, can't go, I wasn't able to go too far back in my genealogy yet, but I'm not finished. And so I wanted the younger generations to at least have the knowledge that my research told me about. So it was for them. And I really wanted to share the horrors of the story of Jewish immigrants and Jews in general. And then for whomever identified with parts of the story. And what I found out afterwards is that people of the Jewish faith thought my book was just like their story, very similar. And people not of the Jewish faith found it interesting because it was new information. So I really wrote it for myself personally, and I felt whoever was going to get something out of it would get something out of it. It wasn't that I was pointing it to a particular audience at that point. When I talked about the research that I did, I should mention that the genealogical research that was so helpful was through a few different sources. I found myself in Salt Lake City on a Western trip, and we went to the Mormon library, and they were very helpful in identifying certain things for me. We found ourselves visiting some friends in the Washington, D.C. area, and I went to the National Archives, and I was able to find out where my maternal grandmother was born, which I never knew. So that was wonderful. And then, before all of those visits, very accidentally, we found ourselves in Montreal. We were only 2.5 hours here in Vermont from Montreal. And we were there on a number of occasions. One time, it was a Sunday, and I said to my husband, let's go to the Jewish library. Let me see what they have there. Well, I walked in, I asked the receptionist, do you have any materials? And she said, oh, she said, go right downstairs. They're meeting right now. The Montreal Jewish Genealogical Society, they're meeting right now. Stanley Diamond is down there. Go right down. They want to know you. Well, I went downstairs, I opened the door, and people were sitting around an oval table, and everything stopped. They looked at me. I thought I could sneak in and sit down and listen. Oh no, they wanted to know everything about me. And they were so helpful. They found the Yiskor book from my grandparents' hometown. The Yiskor books were written after the Holocaust about the hometown, the people that were lost, and all the information historically about that hometown. And I was able to get a copy of this book about my grandparents' hometown. So that was immeasurably exciting. And I had many other visits to the Montreal Genealogical Society. And when the book came out, I went back and presented it to them. So I still am a member of that society, and I still get updates on information. And I just can't say how much they helped me. So the writing technique books that I used, well, I had one book called A Handy Little Guide to Writing Memoir, Shimmering Images by Lisa Dale Norton, Writing a Woman's Life by Carolyn Heilbrunn, The Situation and the Story by Vivian Gornick, The Art of the Personal Narrative, and her own memoirs, Fierce Attachments and Approaching Eye Level, are fabulous. And they are about walks in New York City. The Artful Edit on the Practice of Editing Yourself by Susan Bell. The Triggering Town, Lectures and Essays on Poetry and Writing by Richard Hugo. Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldberg. And then many poetry writing books, which would be too numerous to share right now. And I also, like Denise, I have a friend from the Vermont Poetry Group who is an outstanding grammarian, and she went over it line by line with me so that I was sure that my grammar was okay. And I did something else before I published. I would send the manuscript to writers that I knew and friends, a variety of people, with questions, a list of questions, and ask them to read the draft and answer the questions. And that was the way that I came to edit and know whether I was clear in what I was writing. And that was very helpful. So the form that it took, I've already spoken about. It's a hybrid form of prose and poetry. It's in sections. It's 222 pages. There's a long bibliography at the end of the books that I researched. And I'm just so, it was a formative moment in my life. I'm so happy that I wrote this book for all the reasons that I've mentioned. And I think I've answered most of the questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Deanna. What wonderful writing journeys you've both added to our experience, and your story of the research that you're wanting to find out about your family took you on all these amazing adventures. Um, I do think that's part of the joy of doing this work. Um, uh, when I was working on mine, I started my book before we had the internet, and before we had all these different ways you could do research. My method of finding my uncle in Trinidad was I wrote letters to different towns, hoping that somebody might notice him in the post office, which was actually what happened, and they carried my letter to him. Um, but then there was the internet, and it kind of revolutionized research. I could go into the Harry Truman Presidential Library, and he was in Missouri, but I could do it online and read about, he was our president who started the integration of the armed forces. And there was all these letters, original source materials that I could read that he had written as they were trying to determine how to do this. And so research is, I found it quite an adventure too. It was, and you learn so much from doing this. It's really, writing one of these memoirs is really quite, it's an emotional journey. It's a fact-finding search. It's learning about history and medicine, probably for Deborah, and all kinds of things that some of which you never expected. So thank you so very much, both Deanna and Deborah, for being part of this. And I know we have other memoir writers that are here today. And are there questions or comments you would like to make to be part of this conversation? Ed, then Ginny. I think you're muted, Ed.
First of all, my hearty congratulations to all three of you for this presentation. I mean, absolutely remarkable. One word that did not appear that I recall in here, but I think it applies to all of you, is courage, and how much courage it takes to write about yourself and kind of bare your soul, whatever. I tried a memoir a few years ago, and I was doing it in a episodic form, non-chronological, and I was writing it basically to give to my kids. And I wrote 7,000 words and then deleted everything, gone. And I just didn't have the courage to continue, to embarrass myself, to expose myself, and so forth and so on. But I mean, you three have just done such a remarkable job with your work. I just can only say, congratulations. It was very good.
Could I respond to that a moment? My original, thank you, Ed. My original plan was to just write about my grandparents' generation and my parents' generation. And when I gave it to one of my cousin to read, he said, "Well, where are you?" And I said, "Oh." And I said, "Okay, I will add a section about my growing up in the Bronx, because it's now been ancient and vintage also." And so I did. But before that, I had no plans to add the piece about my growing up.
Interesting. Ginny? You're muted, Ginny. There you go.
I'm back. Okay. And if I go you sometimes fragment. So if it happens to you, it's because my connection, I keep getting a little sign. I'm having a problem with connection. First of all, I'd like to say how enthralled I was for all three of you. It was really, really important for me to listen to all of your story, well, your lives. My life has been very colorful in many ways. And on the other hand, I've got many other stories to tell. I have written my chapters, and I've only written a few in moments. I've called them my 9/11 moment, my African moment, my meeting my husband moment, that kind of thing. And I'm trying to think if there's a tip you can give me as to how to connect those moments. Is there a way, or do I write them in, like, as you are, is in short stories, Deborah? You're doing it in like a short story format.
Yes, and something
Is that the way to do it, you think?
For me, it was for sure, Jenny. Something that I did find, I wrote a class on, I taught a class just through adult education one time in our area about starting your story. And what I did is I explained to them, because sometimes it's just so daunting, the whole project to look at, that for me, it was like little increments. When things came to me, I went ahead, and anything you think is important, it doesn't have to be exactly chronological. You're probably going to want to identify the time period or the phase or stage of your life. But with mine, that's what it was. And I just would, some things I saw that I had duplicated. Stories, parts, or experiences. So I would check that and make sure I didn't have it completely duplicated, and maybe rewrite one of the stories so it didn't include the same thing as another had. But when it comes to the things that impact us so much, life-changing experiences, they come to us and they're right at the forefront when we let them come. And I think that for me, that's the way it was. It was just, there's this short story, there was that experience, there was that, and what might people need to know, or what would help people to know? With me, military families, what would they need to know? What would this veteran that has been nearly homeless or floundering for 40 years, what would be helpful to be acknowledged for them, about how so many honorable people looked dishonorable sometimes, at stages in their life. So for me, Jenny, that's what it was. It was this story, and it just the way my brain and my organization went.
Gary?
One question, Debbie. I just, as Ed said, it is difficult to write about painful experiences in your life. And I've always admired you for writing about those things and having the courage to do that. I have not found the courage to write about some painful things in my life, and it's made me curious about that. And I just connected some dots with my father as a medic in World War II, and the book I'm working on is about World War II and my parents' experiences. And excuse me, I was fortunate enough to. My father was around my age, I guess. He was in his early 80s. And he would never talk about his experiences. When he would begin, they were so horrendous, he would start to get angry and then he wouldn't speak. And I finally got him a little tape recorder, and he recorded several of these especially horrendous experiences as a medic. And he was a frontline medic, so he saw a lot of horror.
I'm sure.
But it was very interesting after he tape recorded these terrible things. And here he was in his early 80s. My mother said it was the first time since World War II that he did not have nightmares.
Oh my.
And it,
Yes.
the,
And what does that tell us, Harry? Exactly. You can't bury it all. You're right.
well, and I was wondering if your writing has been cathartic for you to get it out and share it with others.
I believe that it definitely has. I'm not sure. Sometimes I like to, and maybe it sounds dramatic, but sometimes I think that's how I survived with writing this and sharing it and being able to speak their names. That's really important. I got to speak Brian and Newt many, many times today.
Yes.
And that is good for us. But yes, I do believe it was cathartic. You need to make some sort of sense and to remember why it was so hard.
Yeah.
There are times when I would finish a story and I would have nightmares for a few nights because, and I still do, because why would you not, when you think about it? Why would the pain, it's some of our most painful things, and we've all had them. They're never going to be an easy thing to talk about nonchalantly. But if we can kind of make sense, surround ourselves with safe people like you folks all are, and many other things, we can work through it and then maybe move on to something else we could do in life. I had a dream one time, and it wasn't a nightmare, and Brian had told me to get a hobby, Mom. and he would have he'd say, okay, enough already with the VA, Mom. Okay, enough, you've got stuff. But that's just one of those things. But I it's definitely, for me, it was cathartic, Harry. But you know what, there are still things that I may never be able to put down on paper. So Ed, don't feel bad, because there are things that can be just horrifying or embarrassing or shameful or something you just cannot explain. But I guess that'll, maybe next year I'll be able to. We'll see.
Abby?
Well, first of all, I would just like to thank you all so much. This was so inspiring to listen to the stories, but the different forms of the way that you tell them. I guess for me, it's that the courage is not revealing the feelings to me, because that's not hard for me to do, but to publicly honor yourselves as a conduit of the truth and of information, to the way that you are publicly saying, I am here and there's something I know and I want you to know it. And it's just that, it's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. All of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby.
Thank you, Abby.
Thank you.
Kari?
If I can do this.
There she is.
You're on.
You all, I was so impressed with your presentations today, and I was familiar with you going through the process of putting it together just from long ago when I was really active, and it just made me think again, because of this is my wheelhouse, is to write about my family or things that happened in the past or whatever, in my poetry and in my writing. And it made me think, I've got drawers full of things that I have already written that I just kind of put to the side that I could pull out. And because my kids bought me a book for Christmas, of where I'm supposed to be writing down my life. You know,
Yes.
it asks questions and you write down. And I'm thinking, I started it and I couldn't get finished. It's just got a little bit of paper about like this. And I'm thinking, I've got more to say. Now, am I going to hurt their feelings and not fill out their book? Or am I going to go ahead and pull out what I've already written? And looking at, I want to go back and find more information about my family. And Deanna, just as you have done, I've done a little bit, and I've gathered from papers from everywhere. And then my husband's, because my children don't know. They don't know, and I don't know a whole lot, but I have a family member that's already done a lot of the research. So I'm going to tap some of that, because I think at my age, if I don't already get on it, it's not going to happen. So thank you for sharing and inspiring me to get at it again.
You're so welcome. It's so wonderful when it turns out there's a relative that has some of this information. For me, that turned out to be my uncle Ian in Trinidad. And even before computers, he got into tracking the family genealogy for the Hart side in Trinidad. And he was just the most amazing introduction I could have ever asked to my family. He had it down, and he knew stories about people, and he was very important to me, introducing me to the culture and the history of the country that I really didn't know anything about. And having that kind of a guide is just immeasurable. And for me, my uncle has read earlier drafts of the entire book. Because I really relied on him to correct, you know, some of my American impressions of what the culture there is like, because I haven't lived there as an adult. Yeah. So, any other comments or thoughts? Eileen and then Cheryl. You're muted, Eileen.
So I wanted to say, Deanna, the book that you mentioned, Vivian Gornick's Situation, the Story, my critique group, it talks about it every single time we meet. Everybody raves about it. I have a copy of it, and I haven't read it. So now I'm inspired to get it out. Here it is.
Read it.
And I was just looking at one little part, and it says, every work of literature has both a situation and a story. The situation is the context of circumstance, sometimes the plot. The story is the emotional experience. So I think that's so important in memoir writing. And, you know, I don't read these kind of books for the most part, and I really need to. So thank you. I took it off the shelf while I was on.
Great. Cheryl?
I just wanted to thank you all. You make our lives richer by sharing your stories.
Thank you.
So I don't know if you realize and appreciate that, but it's true. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anne?
Yes, I want to echo that. I have read Deanna's book, and I'm eager to read Deborah's and yours, Denise, when it is finally published. But in doing my short memoir, I did send it to some readers to make sure that they were okay with what I was writing, and their feelings about it. And those several people not only gave me good edits, but also gave me words that I could use as testimonials. So that's something. But I would encourage Kari and Jenny to get busy, because we're not getting any younger.
Yeah.
And you do have to be a risk taker to do this. It does take courage to put down your story or pieces of your story and share with the world. And you never know who you're going to touch with your words. And a dear friend of mine has written his story as a result of writing mine. And he said it's going to be published in March. And I'm so happy for him. He's in his 80s as well. And he just wanted to do this. And it will It will be such a wonderful thing for others to read. And so I think this was a great session today, and thank you so much for sharing. It was wonderful.
So welcome, Bill.
Yeah, I just want to say congratulations. It was a great session. Really, very much enjoyed it. And Denise, I think you did a wonderful job by bringing Deanna and Deborah in, showing us the different types of memoirs that we can all enjoy. And I'm wondering, I've got a lot of questions, but we're kind of running short on time. What's the best way to get a hold of Deanna's book and Deborah's work as well? Maybe that's something you can share with us either on Pen Points or on Facebook or, just our website or something. We got a lot of ways that we can share that information. And now I'm dying to read these works and, find out a little bit more. It's interesting to hear about your lives and, what you've gone through. And so I hope you can share that information with us. Other than that, that's just good job. Very, very well done. Very compelling session.
I believe both Deanna and Deborah's books are listed under the authors, about our authors section on the website now.
Yes.
Deanna, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would just like to encourage Ed and anyone else to write your stories and to see how far you can go, how deep you can go in sharing your memories. And that's enough. Because I think future generations will appreciate, and who knows who else. So I just want to encourage.
Thank you.
You don't, and I would like to add that in the beginning, you really don't need to think about publishing. I wasn't sure where I was going with mine, and I truly didn't think I would have a publishable book at some point, or who would be interested in reading it about this tiny little Caribbean island, no one's basically heard of usually in the North. And so, Ginny, especially you have some, I know, very amazing life experiences. I would say just get it out on the paper, on the computer, whatever your preferred method of starting to write is, and suspend the idea of the rest of the world has to see it, because there's something in you that wants to come out on the page. You mentioned that, and you could be like Ed, you could try and do it and then say, oh, this isn't going anywhere. Or you could try and do it and say, hey, I'm really getting into this. Let's see where it goes. But I think to honor that impulse, to get it down and see what happens from there. For me, all I can say is it's been a grand adventure that I never would have expected. So it can kind of reshape your life sometimes. So have fun with it and just get the words out on paper. Karen?
This is just for Ed, wherever you went. I don't know in this.
In the box.
If you do like you used to do and get up early in the morning and start to write, start writing again, whatever you can remember of what you tore up and threw away. And you got it. I mean, I know you got it out, but you don't have to publish it. And then you can go through and say, well, they don't need to know this, or they don't need to know this. But you got to tell it. You got to tell your life to your kids. They need to know. That's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you.
I just wanted to say Deanna's book is available in the library.
It is.
Oh,
Yeah.
it is.
What's the name of the book?
The place you live in.
Oh,
And I actually have the Elsie Quirk Library copy right now. Because Deanna's up in Vermont, and I checked it out. I said, hey, it's here. So
Yeah.
so I will return it. And I have read it before. So
Yeah, I like Pam's way of keeping warm with the dog.
Oh dear.
There you go.
They've had the coldest winter on record.
of course.
you got there just
Not as cold as Mount Washington.
But at least you're not in the New England right now.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
everybody.
This was,
Bye.
this was a great.
Well,
Enjoyed it
thank
so much.
you.
Y'all did
Yeah.
great.
Thank you. Take
Thank you so
care.
much, everyone. It was a wonderful
Yeah.
session.
It
Fun
was.
session, yes.
Thank you for
Thank you.
this.
You're
Take
welcome.
care.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Have a
Bye.
good week.
Right here.